I said, this is going to be a hit. I felt this is a winner. I can't wait to read it. So I read it, and I loved the role of Blanche. And I called my agent and told her so. She said, they're going to give that to Betty White. And so look at the role of Rose. And I said, but I can't play Rose. I've got to play Blanche. She said, well, you can either be in the series and play Rose, or you can forget it.
Rue McClanahan had two great fears in her life, and she named them both. The first was dying alone. The second was being left, being abandoned, being alone and unnoticed, the feeling that no one in the world was aware of her existence. She wrote about it plainly. She said she felt she had to have someone there with her, who knew she was alive, who saw her, so that she would not be alone and abandoned and unnoticed. And so, over the course of her life, in an effort to outrun those two fears, Rue McClanahan got married 6 times. 6 husbands, 5 divorces, a jazz musician, a college friend, an Italian actor, a Greek realtor, her high school sweetheart, and finally, at 63, an actor who would be the one who lasted. She rushed into marriages. She refused prenuptial agreements. She married men she barely knew after knowing them for weeks, because being married felt safer than being alone, and being alone was the thing she could not bear. One of those marriages lasted 17 months. One of them cost her a fortune when it collapsed. One of them she entered, in her own words, purely out of the fear of abandonment. And the cruel joke of it, the thing that makes her story so much sadder than the character that made her famous, is that Rue McClanahan spent her whole life playing Blanche Devereaux. Blanche, on The Golden Girls, was the man-eating Southern belle, the vain, confident, endlessly desired sex goddess who treated men as a buffet and never doubted for a second that she was wanted. Blanche was the fantasy of a woman who feared nothing, who could have any man and discard him without a backward glance, and the woman who played her, so convincingly that America believed the two were the same person, was in reality a frightened, insecure, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times divorced woman who married again and again, not out of confidence but out of terror, not because she believed she was irresistible, but because she could not stand to be alone in a room. Her third husband said it flatly. He said that despite the character she played, Rue was not really like that at all. He said she was a pretty straight-laced woman. The oversexed goddess was a performance. The real Rue McClanahan was a woman from small-town Oklahoma who was afraid, her entire life, of ending up with no one. She chased love through 6 marriages, watched 5 of them fail, paid dearly for some of them, and kept trying anyway, because the alternative, the thing she feared most, was to stop trying and be left alone. And here is the part that makes it, in the end, not a tragedy but something closer to grace. The 6th one worked. The last husband, the one she married at 63 after 5 failures, was still there at the very end. When Rue McClanahan died in 2010, the woman whose greatest fear was dying alone was surrounded by the people who loved her, with her 6th husband at her side, a man who said afterward that he had never loved anyone the way he loved her. She spent her whole life afraid of dying alone, and she didn't. This is the story of Rue McClanahan, the 6 husbands, and the fear that drove her into every one of those marriages, and the one that finally, at the very end, set the fear to rest. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Before she was Blanche Devereaux, before she was a golden girl, before the 6 husbands and the 5 divorces, she was Eddie Rue McClanahan, a little girl from a tiny oil town in southern Oklahoma. She was born on February 21st, 1934, in Healdton, Oklahoma, a small town in the oil fields near the Texas border. Her name was a construction, the kind of name that small-town American families made by combining pieces of other names. Her father's middle name was Edwin, which became Eddie. Her mother's middle name was Roa, which became Rue, Eddie Rue. She dropped the Eddie later in life, partly because it kept getting mistaken for a man's name, once so thoroughly that she received a military conscription notice intended for a male Eddie. She became, simply, Rue. Her father, William Edwin McClanahan, called Bill, was a building contractor. Her mother, Dreda, was a beautician. They were Methodists, of Irish and Choctaw ancestry. Rue would later write about a Choctaw great-grandfather named Running Hawk. The family settled in Ardmore, Oklahoma, another small town, and that is where Rue grew up, a bright, imaginative, stage-struck girl in a place where being stage-struck marked you as different. She was drawn to performance from the very beginning. By her own account, she made her stage debut at the age of 4 in a local production called The Three Little Kittens. She performed in plays all through school. At Ardmore High School, she won a gold medal in oration, and she was a member of the National Honor Society, a smart girl as well as a talented one. She went on to the University of Tulsa, where she majored in German and theater, graduated cum laude, and joined a sorority, where she served as vice president. On paper, she was a small-town success story, accomplished, popular, headed somewhere. But underneath the accomplishments, something else was forming, and it is the thing that would drive the entire romantic arc of her life. Rue McClanahan was, at her core, insecure and afraid of being alone. Where exactly that fear came from, she never fully diagnosed in public, but its shape is unmistakable across everything she later said and wrote about herself. She had a bottomless need to be seen, to be wanted, to have someone present who was aware of her existence. The stage was part of the answer to that need, because an audience sees you, an audience is aware of you, an audience gives you, for the length of a performance, the certainty that you exist in other people's eyes. But an audience goes home. And when the audience went home, Rue needed someone in the room. This is a common enough shape in performers, the outsized need for external validation coexisting with a private insecurity, the confidence on stage masking the fear off it. What made Rue's version so consequential is how directly it translated into her romantic life. Some people with that fear pour it entirely into their work. Rue poured it into marriage. She needed, in the most literal and constant way, a partner physically present in her life, a person who anchored her against the terror of being alone and unnoticed, and she needed it so badly that she would marry to get it, repeatedly, rashly, on short acquaintance, choosing the security of being married over the wisdom of choosing well. She left Oklahoma after college and headed for New York to become an actress. It was the early to mid-1950s. She was a young woman with real talent, real training, and real ambition, and she was walking into the hardest business in the world, the New York theater, where thousands of talented young people competed for a handful of roles, and most of them failed. It was a life of auditions and rejection and instability, and long stretches of not knowing where the next job or the next dollar was coming from. For a woman whose deepest fear was being alone and unnoticed, the actor's life in New York was, in a sense, the worst possible environment, because it was built entirely out of the things she feared: uncertainty, rejection, the constant risk of being overlooked. And so it makes a terrible kind of sense that as she pursued her career through the late 1950s, scraping by, working as a file clerk between acting jobs, she also began, almost immediately, to reach for the other thing she needed, which was a husband, someone to be there, someone aware of her existence, someone so that she would not be alone. She found the first one at a playhouse in Pennsylvania in 1957. His name was Tom Bish, and with him, at 24 years old, Rue McClanahan began the cycle of marriage and divorce that would repeat, in one form or another, for the next 40 years. Rue met Tom Bish while she was working as a file clerk and chasing acting jobs at a gig at the Erie Playhouse in Pennsylvania. He was a musician. They married in 1958, when Rue was 24, and the following year she gave birth to her only child, a son she named Mark. And then, within about 17 months of the wedding, the marriage was over. 17 months. The first marriage, the one that produced her only child, the one that made her a mother, collapsed almost before it had begun. The divorce left her, in the accounts of the period, heartbroken and disillusioned. She had married expecting, as she put it later, to be married once and forever, the way girls from small Methodist towns in Oklahoma were raised to expect. Instead, she was, before she was 26, a divorced single mother with an infant son and an unstable career, living the exact life of uncertainty and aloneness that she feared most. What she did next tells you everything about the engine that drove her. She did not take time to recover. She did not process the heartbreak, or steady herself, or learn from what had gone wrong. She got married again, almost immediately, while the divorce from Bish was still being processed. The second husband was Norman Hartweg, a friend from her college days. And the reason she married him is the key that unlocks the whole pattern, because it had almost nothing to do with romantic love. Rue married Hartweg by the understanding of the people who knew her and by the shape of her own later reflections, largely because she was desperate to provide a father for her infant son and desperate not to be alone. She had a baby. She had no partner. She was terrified. And here was a familiar face, a friend, a man who could fill the empty place in the house and in her life. So she married him. It did not work, because marriages entered out of fear and logistical desperation rarely do. Rue and Norman Hartweg separated shortly after the wedding and divorced in 1961. The marriage barely existed. Notably, though, Hartweg remained a close friend of hers even after the divorce, which points to something important about Rue McClanahan that runs alongside the sad pattern. The men in her life often genuinely liked her, stayed fond of her, spoke well of her afterward. She was not marrying monsters. She was marrying men she liked and men who liked her, for reasons that had more to do with her fear than with any real assessment of whether the marriage should happen. The problem was not the men, mostly. The problem was the reason she kept marrying them. 2 marriages down before she was 30, 2 divorces, a young son, and a pattern now clearly established. Rue McClanahan reached for marriage the way a frightened person reaches for a railing, grabbing whatever was nearest to steady herself, and the grabbing kept failing, because a railing chosen in panic is not the same as a partner chosen with care. Her third marriage would last longer, and it would fail in a way that was, if anything, even more revealing about the forces at work in her life, because this time the marriage would be ended not by Rue and not by the husband, but by her own son, who finally reached the limit of what he could stand. She met Peter DeMaio when they co-starred together in an off-Broadway production of The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. He was an actor, hot-tempered, and Rue called him, in her memoir, the Italian. They married in 1964. And once again, the marriage was, at least in part, about her son. Rue was still trying to give Mark a 2-parent home, still trying to construct the stable family unit that she believed a child needed and that she needed, still operating on the principle that a husband in the house was better than no husband in the house. But this time the arithmetic backfired badly, because Mark and Peter DeMaio could not stand each other. The hot-tempered stepfather and the growing boy clashed, and the household that Rue had married to create became a source of conflict rather than stability. The marriage lasted 7 years, longer than the first 2 combined, but it was strained by the war between her husband and her child, and it finally ended for the most heartbreaking reason imaginable. Mark, by then a teenager, gave his mother an ultimatum. He told her, in no uncertain terms, that he was going to leave, that he would go to Oklahoma to live with family, unless she divorced DeMaio. Her own son was telling her that he could not live in the home she had built, that he would rather leave her than stay in a house with the man she had married. At the urging of her son and a couples counselor, Rue divorced Peter DeMaio in 1971. 3 marriages, 3 divorces, and the woman who kept marrying to build a stable home for her child had just been forced to end a marriage by that same child, who found the home unlivable. The fear of being alone had led her, once again, straight into the thing it was trying to prevent. By the early 1970s, with 3 marriages behind her, Rue McClanahan's career finally began to catch fire, and it happened because of one man's eye for talent. His name was Norman Lear, and he was the most powerful producer in American television, the creator of All in the Family, and a string of groundbreaking sitcoms that were reshaping what television could do and say. Lear saw Rue perform and recognized what she had, that rare combination of comic timing, warmth, and a slightly wicked edge. He cast her in a guest spot on All in the Family in 1971, and then he gave her the role that would establish her, casting her as Vivian Harmon, the best friend of the title character on Maude, the All in the Family spin-off starring Bea Arthur. Maude ran from 1972 to 1978, and it made Rue McClanahan a working, recognizable television actress at last. She played Vivian, Maude's flighty, flirtatious best friend, for 6 years. It was steady work, real money, real visibility. It also, in one of the quiet ironies of her career, paired her for the first time with Bea Arthur, the formidable, deep-voiced actress who would, a decade later, stand beside her again in the show that made them both immortal. The two women built a working relationship on Maude that would pay off enormously when they were reunited on The Golden Girls. So the professional fear, the fear of being unnoticed and overlooked, was finally being answered. Rue was noticed now. She was on a hit show. She had arrived. But the personal fear, the fear of being alone, of having no one in the room, was untouched by any of it, and in 1976, in the middle of her success on Maude, Rue McClanahan married for the 4th time, and this marriage she would later describe with a devastating honesty that names the fear directly. The 4th husband was a realtor named Gus Fisher. Rue called him, in her memoir, the Greek, and when she explained years later why she had married him, she did not dress it up as romance or passion or love. She said it plainly. She said she jumped into the relationship, in part, out of fear of abandonment. She wrote that she felt she had to have someone there with her who was aware of her existence, that she was not alone, abandoned, and unnoticed. Read that sentence again, because it is the thesis of Rue McClanahan's entire romantic life, stated in her own words. I felt I had to have someone there with me who was aware of my existence, that I was not alone, abandoned and unnoticed. That is not a description of falling in love. That is a description of a woman using marriage as a treatment for terror. Gus Fisher was not chosen because Rue loved him beyond reason. He was chosen because his presence in her house meant that someone was aware she existed, and being aware she existed was the thing she needed a human being to do for her at all times, or the old fear came flooding back. The marriage was, predictably, a fluke, her word again. A relationship entered as a treatment for a fear, rather than as a genuine partnership, had nothing real at its foundation, and within a relatively short time she and Gus were discussing divorce. The 4th marriage ended in 1981. Rue was now 4 times married and 4 times divorced, and she was in her mid to late 40s, and the pattern had held with an almost mechanical consistency across more than 2 decades. Marry out of fear. Watch it fail. Be alone again. Marry again, to escape being alone. Watch that fail too. It is worth pausing here to say something clearly, because it would be easy to tell this story as a comedy of a woman who just couldn't stop getting married, and that would be cruel, and it would miss the point. Rue McClanahan was not foolish. She was not shallow. She was a smart, accomplished, hard-working, talented woman who was carrying a genuine psychological wound, a real and painful fear that shaped her choices in a way she could see clearly enough to write about, but could not, for most of her life, actually overcome. That is what a wound like this does. It is not stupidity, it is compulsion. She knew, on some level, exactly what she was doing. She wrote it down. I married him out of fear of abandonment, and knowing it did not stop her, because insight and healing are not the same thing, and Rue had plenty of the first, and for most of her life, not enough of the second. 4 marriages down. And the biggest role of her life, the one that would make her a household name and a gay icon and a television legend, The role of a fearless, man-devouring southern goddess, who was everything Rue was afraid she was not, was still ahead of her. So was the fifth husband, and he was going to cost her. In 1985, Rue McClanahan was cast in the role that would define her, and the casting almost went the other way. The show was The Golden Girls, a sitcom about 4 older women, 3 of them widowed or divorced, sharing a house in Miami. It was a genuinely revolutionary premise for American television, a comedy that centered women over 50, that treated them as full human beings with careers and appetites and romantic lives and sharp opinions, at a time when the industry considered women that age invisible. The 4 leads were Bea Arthur, Betty White, Estelle Getty, and Rue McClanahan. Originally, the producers had considered Rue for the role of Rose, the sweet, naive, dim-witted one, because she had played a similar sweet character on Maude, and had considered Betty White for the role of Blanche, the vain man-crazy one, because White had played a similar man-crazy character on the Mary Tyler Moore Show. Then someone made the inspired decision to swap them, to cast against the actress's previous type, and the entire history of television comedy pivoted on that swap. Betty White became Rose, and Rue McClanahan became Blanche Devereaux. Blanche was a creation for the ages. She was a Southern belle from Atlanta, a widow, vain, glamorous, endlessly and shamelessly interested in men, utterly convinced of her own irresistibility. Blanche never doubted that she was desired. Blanche treated the entire male population as a personal buffet. Blanche was confidence and sexuality and self-assurance turned up to a level that was absurd and glorious, and above all, fearless. Rue played her brilliantly, with impeccable comic timing and a purring southern drawl, and Blanche became one of the most beloved comic characters in the history of the medium. The Golden Girls ran for 7 seasons, from 1985 to 1992, and it made all 4 women legends. Rue won the Emmy Award for Outstanding Lead Actress in a Comedy Series in 1987. And here is the gap that sits at the center of Rue McClanahan's entire story. Blanche Devereaux was everything Rue McClanahan was not. Blanche feared nothing about men or desire or being wanted. Blanche was never afraid of being alone. Blanche assumed a man would always be available whenever she snapped her fingers. Blanche's confidence was total. And the woman playing her so convincingly that fans genuinely believed Rue and Blanche were the same person was in private the opposite. A woman defined by insecurity, driven into marriage after marriage by the terror of being alone, reaching for husbands not out of Blanche's bottomless confidence but out of a bottomless fear. Her third husband, Peter DeMaio, put the truth on the record. Despite the man-eating goddess she played, he said, Rue was not really like that at all. She was, he said, a pretty straight-laced woman. The sexual confidence, the fearlessness, the certainty of being desired, all of it was a performance, a character, a role. The real Rue was a woman from Ardmore, Oklahoma, who was afraid, every day of her life, of ending up with no one. And then, in the middle of the run that made her a fearless icon, the frightened real woman got married again, for the 5th time, and it went exactly as the fear always made it go. The 5th husband was Tom Keel, her high school sweetheart from Oklahoma. They had not seen each other since high school, decades earlier, when he turned up to visit her in Los Angeles. Rue explained the marriage, once again, with an honesty that reveals the wound. She said she was looking for someone to trust, and they had been close once, long ago. They got married within a couple of months. It was, she admitted, a very rash thing. A couple of months. She married a man she had not seen since high school, after knowing him again for a matter of weeks, because she was looking for someone to trust, and because being married was better than being alone. It was the same pattern that had produced 4 previous divorces, running one more time, and this time it carried a financial cost, because Rue McClanahan, at the peak of her fame and earning power, refused to sign a prenuptial agreement. She married Keel in the mid-1980s, right at the start of her Emmy-winning run as Blanche. The marriage lasted about a year. It ended in 1986, in a messy and expensive divorce, and because she had refused the prenup, Tom Keel walked away with a large financial settlement. The high school sweetheart she had married in a rash rush of longing for someone to trust left the marriage with a significant piece of her money. Rue said afterward that the fifth marriage had cured her. She meant it as a rueful joke, the idea that this one had finally been painful and costly enough to break the pattern, to teach her the lesson that 5 divorces should teach. And for a while it seemed true. Rue McClanahan stayed single for years after Tom Keel. 5 marriages, 5 divorces, and now, at last, a stretch of standing on her own. But the fear had not been cured. It had only gone quiet. And the woman who was afraid of dying alone still had one more marriage in her, the 6th, the last one, and it was going to be the one that finally answered the fear that all the others had failed to answer. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. For a stretch of years in her 50s and early 60s, Rue McClanahan was on her own, and she survived it, which was itself something new. The Golden Girls ended in 1992. Rue continued working on the short-lived sequel The Golden Palace, and in television and stage roles, a respected and beloved veteran actress with an Emmy and a permanent place in the affection of millions. She was famous, she was financially recovered from the Keel divorce, and she was, for the first time in her adult life, sustaining a period of being single without immediately reaching for the nearest railing. But the fear had not left her. It had simply gone underground. The woman who had written that she needed someone in the room who was aware of her existence had not stopped being that woman just because 5 marriages had failed. The need was still there. The terror of ending her life alone was still there, and as she moved into her 60s, into the age when the fear of dying alone stops being abstract and starts being concrete, it was still waiting. And then, in 1997, at the age of 63, Rue McClanahan got married for the 6th time. The man was Morrow Wilson, an actor and producer, full name Charles Morrow Wilson. He came from her own world, the theatre and entertainment world, a man who understood the life she had lived and the business she had spent decades in. And this time, something was different. This time, the marriage worked. It is worth asking why the 6th one succeeded when the first 5 had all failed, and the answer seems to be a combination of things that had finally changed, some in her circumstances, and some in her. Rue was 63 now, not a frightened young single mother or a woman in the anxious middle of a career. She had done the work, achieved the success, weathered the failures, and arrived at a place of relative stability in herself. And Morrow Wilson, by every account, was simply a good and loving partner, a man who genuinely adored her and who was in it for the long term. The marriage that Rue entered in 1997 was not, like so many of the others, a panicked grab at a railing. It was, at last, something closer to a real partnership between 2 people who wanted to be together. It became, by a wide margin, the longest marriage of her life. Where the first 5 had lasted 17 months, 2 years, 7 years, 5 years, and 1 year, the marriage to Morrow Wilson lasted 13 years, from 1997 until her death in 2010. After a lifetime of marriages that collapsed almost as fast as she could enter them, Rue McClanahan finally had one that lasted, one that endured through her 60s and into her 70s, one that was still standing when everything else began to fail. Because the last years of Rue's life brought a cascade of serious illness, and it was during those years, the hardest years, that the value of the 6th marriage revealed itself most fully. In 1997, the same year she married Morrow, Rue was diagnosed with breast cancer. She fought it and survived it, and she became, characteristically, an advocate, speaking publicly about her diagnosis to encourage other women to get screened, turning her own frightening experience into something useful for strangers. She beat the cancer, but her health, from that point on, was a mounting series of challenges. Through the 2000s, she kept working when she could, including a run on Broadway in 2005 as Madame Morrible in the hit musical Wicked, a remarkable thing for a woman in her 70s, still on a Broadway stage, still performing, still doing the thing she had loved since she was 4 years old, in a production of The Three Little Kittens. The stage had been her first source of being seen, and it stayed with her nearly to the end. But her body was failing. In late 2009, Rue underwent heart bypass surgery, a serious operation for a woman of 75. And while she was recovering from the surgery, she suffered a stroke. The combination was devastating. The stroke and the surgical complications began a final decline from which she would not recover. Through all of it, Morrow Wilson was there. The marriage had reportedly hit a rough patch late. Some accounts note that the couple was legally separated at the very end. But separated on paper or not, when the crisis came, when Rue was dying, Morrow Wilson was at her side, along with her son Mark, and her sister, and the people who loved her. The sixth husband, the one who lasted, did not leave. He was present for exactly the thing Rue had feared her whole life, and his presence was the answer to it. Rue McClanahan had spent 40 years and 6 marriages trying to make sure that when the end came, she would not face it alone. 5 times the effort had failed, and she had ended up exactly where she feared. But the 6th time, at 63, she had finally gotten it right. And so, when the end actually came, the woman whose deepest fear was dying alone was not alone at all. Rue McClanahan died on June 3, 2010, in New York City. She was 76 years old. The cause was a brain hemorrhage, following the stroke and the complications from her heart surgery. She died in the hospital, and she died surrounded by the people who loved her. Her son Mark was there, her only child, the boy for whom she had entered at least 2 of her marriages, trying to build him a home. Her sister was there. Her 6th husband, Morrow Wilson, was there. The woman whose 2 great fears were being abandoned and dying alone died with her family around her, held in exactly the kind of presence she had spent her entire life terrified she would not have. Think about the distance she traveled to arrive at that ending. A frightened girl from Ardmore, Oklahoma, who needed to be seen so badly that she made a life out of performing for audiences, and a private life out of marrying men so she would not be alone in a room. A woman who married 6 times, who divorced 5 times, who admitted in her own words that she married at least 1 husband purely out of the fear of abandonment, who rushed into unions after knowing men for weeks, who refused prenuptial agreements and paid for it, who kept reaching and reaching for the security that kept slipping through her fingers. 5 times she had failed to build the thing she needed. 5 times she had ended up alone again, the exact outcome she was trying to escape. And then, at 63, after a lifetime of getting it wrong, she got it right. And the getting it right was what carried her through the hardest years of her life and delivered her, at the end, into a death that was everything her fear had told her it would not be. Morrow Wilson spoke about her after she died, and what he said cut straight to the heart of the story. He said, "I've never loved anyone the way I loved Rue." He also said, of the reruns that would keep playing forever, thank God for videotape, that those reruns would go on for the rest of everyone's lives, so that she would always, in that way, be with us. It was the tribute of a man who had genuinely loved her, the 6th husband who turned out to be the one who meant it, the one who stayed, the one who was there. Rue's autobiography, which she published in 2007, 3 years before she died, was titled My First 5 Husbands and the Ones Who Got Away. The title is a joke, and it is also, when you understand her life, quietly profound. My First 5 Husbands. She wrote it while married to the 6th, and by calling the others her first 5, she was quietly acknowledging what the 6th had become, which was the last one, the final one, the one that did not end in divorce or disaster, but in a love that lasted until death. The book was raucous and funny and honest, full of her affairs and her mistakes and her rueful self-knowledge, a woman looking back at a chaotic romantic life and laughing at it rather than weeping over it. But underneath the jokes was the truth she never hid, that all of it, The 6 marriages and the 5 divorces and the reaching and the failing had come from a place of fear. Look at the whole shape of it. On television, for 7 years, Rue McClanahan played Blanche Devereaux, the fearless goddess, the woman who never once worried whether she was wanted, who treated love as a game she always won. And America believed that was who Rue was, because she played it so perfectly. But the woman behind Blanche was almost her exact opposite. Where Blanche was fearless, Rue was afraid. Where Blanche was certain she was desired, Rue was never certain of anything except that she could not bear to be alone. Where Blanche discarded men with a laugh, Rue clung to them out of terror, and married them, and lost them, and married again. The genius of her performance as Blanche was that it was, in a sense, a portrait of the woman Rue McClanahan wished she could be, confident, unafraid, whole on her own. Rue spent her life playing that woman on a soundstage and being a very different, much more frightened woman when she went home, and the tragedy would have been complete. The gap between the fearless character and the fearful woman would have been the whole sad story, except for one thing. At the very end, the frightened woman got the fearless woman's ending, not through confidence, not through fearlessness, through persistence, through refusing to stop trying, even after 5 failures, even carrying a fear that never fully left her. Rue McClanahan kept reaching for love until, at 63, love finally reached back and stayed. And because she never gave up, because she married that 6th time despite everything the first 5 should have taught her about the risk, she was not alone at the end. She was held. She was seen. She was loved by a man who said he had never loved anyone the way he loved her. She was afraid, her whole life, of dying alone. And she didn't. That is not a tragedy. After everything, after all 6 of them, that is a woman who finally, at the very last, beat the thing she was most afraid of. The fear drove her into 6 marriages, and the 6th one, the last one, was the one that proved the fear wrong. Before the end came, Rue McClanahan spent her final decade becoming something more than a beloved sitcom actress, and doing it while her body slowly turned against her. The years after the Golden Girls could have been a quiet coast into retirement. They were not. Rue kept working with the appetite of a woman who had been performing since she was 4 years old and did not know how to stop. She reprised Blanche on the short-lived spin-off The Golden Palace. She did guest roles, stage work, voice work. And in 2005, at 71 years old, she walked onto a Broadway stage in one of the biggest musicals in the world, Wicked, playing Madame Morrible. Think about the stamina and the will that required. A woman in her 70s performing 8 shows a week in a demanding Broadway production. The stage had been the first place Rue ever felt seen, back in that production of The 3 Little Kittens in small-town Oklahoma. And she was still there, still on the boards, nearly 70 years later. She also became, in these years, something she had not set out to be and came to embrace fully, an icon to the gay community, and an outspoken activist. The Golden Girls had always had a large and devoted gay following, drawn to its warmth, its wit, its embrace of outsiders and chosen family, and its refusal to treat older women as disposable. Rue leaned into that connection with genuine warmth. She became an advocate for gay rights and for animal rights, a passionate supporter of causes she believed in, using the fame Blanche had given her to speak up for people and creatures who needed the volume. The woman who had spent her life afraid of being unnoticed used her hard-won visibility, at the end, on behalf of others. And she wrote her book. In 2007, at 73, Rue published her memoir, My First 5 Husbands, and the Ones Who Got Away, and she held nothing back. She wrote about the marriages, the affairs, the mistakes, the men she had loved, in what she called both the platonic and the biblical senses. She was funny about it, and honest about it, and unsparing about herself. It was the book of a woman who had made peace with her own chaotic history by looking straight at it and laughing, a woman secure enough at last to tell the whole truth about how frightened she had once been. There is a small, poignant detail from around the book's release that says something about even the sixth marriage. Rue reportedly noted that her husband, Morrow Wilson, would not read the book, the tell-all about her first 5 husbands and the men who got away. Even the marriage that lasted, the good one, the one that held, had its own complications and its own quiet distances. Some accounts indicate that Rue and Morrow were legally separated in the last stretch before her death, that the 13-year marriage had grown difficult near the end, the way long marriages sometimes do. The story of Rue McClanahan is not a fairy tale, where the 6th husband was flawless and everything was perfect forever after. It is something more honest and more human than that. The 6th marriage was real, and it was loving, and it was also, like everything in Rue's life, complicated. But here is what mattered when it counted. Whatever difficulties the marriage had in its final phase, whatever the legal status was on paper, when Rue McClanahan's health collapsed, Morrow Wilson did not disappear. He was there. And her health did collapse, steadily and then catastrophically. The breast cancer in 1997 had been the first blow, survived. Then, in the 2000s, the cardiovascular problems mounted. In late 2009, she underwent triple bypass heart surgery, a major operation for a woman of 75. And in the recovery from that surgery, the thing that so often follows such operations in the elderly happened. She suffered a stroke. The 1-2 combination of major heart surgery and a stroke is brutal on an aging body, and Rue did not fully recover from it. She was weakened, impaired, and vulnerable, and the woman who had been so vital, so funny, so relentlessly alive, entered the final months of her life diminished by the failures of her own body. Her son Mark was close to her through all of it. Mark Bish, her only child, born in 1959 from that first short marriage to Tom Bish, the boy she had tried so hard to build homes for through marriage after marriage. Whatever those efforts had cost, whatever the failed stepfathers had put him through, Mark was there for his mother at the end, part of the small circle of family that gathered around her as she declined. The home Rue had spent her life trying to construct through husbands, she had, in the most important sense, already had all along, in her son and her sister, the blood family, that stayed when the marriages did not. By the spring of 2010, it was clear that Rue McClanahan was dying, and the people who loved her gathered, and they did for her the one thing she had feared all her life she would not have, which was to make sure that when the end came, she would not face it by herself.